Greetings, this is Peter Williams, and for week 3, LGBTQIA+, I'm going to be discussing the book The Rules Do Not Apply, which is a nonfiction memoir by Ariel Levy. And it relates to this week's topic because it deals with marriage between two lesbians during the 2000s when gay marriage was only legal in the US and California and Massachusetts. It also contains a character that was born a lesbian and transitioned into a man. To a lesser extent, it also gives some insight into past and present activism, outside views on LGBTQIA+, and gay culture in different countries. As far as the book itself, it is in first-person perspective, as it is Ariel's memoir, and it begins the story with her stating that her son is dead, her husband left, and her house has been lost. And then from there, she begins to discuss events of her life in different sequence as they pertain to her job, her life, and her marriage. And she begins this with talking about how she wanted to be a writer ever since she was young. And eventually she ends up working for a magazine in New York in 1996. And she ends up getting her first story published dealing with obese women and their night culture, basically them going out dancing. And eventually this leads to her being promoted to a staff writer at the age of 28. And then eventually she does get married. And her job basically deals with her traveling all over the world to different places to write stories. And at this point in her life, she's still hesitant of having children. Then the story jumps ahead to her at the age of 35. And she's going to Africa because she wants to talk to this person, Semenya, who is an extremely fast runner, and her gender has always been a curiosity. And she ends up getting the chance to meet her, and she wants to interview her, but Semenya declines. And after meeting with her and getting a chance to get various views on Africa as far as like the landscape and animals, she ends up messaging a former lover on her laptops saying that she was seeing lions. And she foreshadows that this is going to be, that this was not a good idea. She then jumps further back to when she was younger, talking about her mother and how she had a friend named Marcus, and how she was always kind of suspicious of Marcus and that they were having an affair. And then talks about how her dad eventually moves to Washington, and she and her mother don't follow him, and eventually her parents get divorced. And when they get divorced, she stops seeing Marcus. And her mother now lives in Massachusetts and is dating a man named Ed. The story then jumps ahead, and she's talking about how she noticed that porn stars and strippers are starting to become like a part of popular culture, and she eventually ends up writing what would eventually be her first book that she ended up and the first in a series of collections that she did with editor by the name of Holman's. And then she also discusses experiencing 9/11 in New York and the things that happened, as well as going to bars and seeing one of her favorite stand-up comedians. And for the record, she doesn't mention him by name, but the comedian that she's referring to is Dave Attell, because I know that pumpkin joke anywhere. She also talks about how her dad gets cancer, and she's obviously worried about him dying, but he does eventually get better, and he gets surgery. She also then refers to a blackout that happened, and that's where she met Lucy. And she immediately has a crush on her, but Lucy is already with another woman. So Ariel is kind of sort of a mistress to her. But they start messaging each other, visiting each other, and then jump ahead to when she's almost 30. They're writing their vows, they're going to be getting married, they have a lot of fun together, and they drink constantly. And when referring to this time when she's getting married, Ariel does address that Lucy is her second female love, and we'll be discussing that more in a bit. Their wedding is in Virginia, and when they move into their house, they enjoy gardening. But at the age of when she gets to the age of 32, she still has no child. Eventually, she does get a job working for the New Yorker. And her first story is Lamar Van Dyke, and we'll be talking more about her in a bit as well. And as she's married to Lucy, Lucy has dreams of getting rich. She wants to start her own business, and she's selling solar panels. And when she gets to age 35, children start to become a bit of a big deal to Ariel. And she's thinking, well, I'm getting older, and obviously when you get older, it starts to become more of an issue as far as whether or not you do or do not want to have children. And also during this time, the former lover that she messaged is actually also her first female love interest, who was named Jen at the time. But Jen has now actually transitioned to a man by the name of Jim. And he and Ariel decide to meet up, and Ariel sees that Jen is now this handsome man, and she refers to how he was kind of clingy and possessive and all these issues when he was still a woman. But now that he was a man, he kind of seemed more calm, and he seemed like he was a better person. And at that point, they do start to have an affair, and she does end up confessing this to Lucy. And again, interjecting throughout the story, it does talk about her traveling to different places and interviewing different people. And at this point of the story, she interviews Mike Huckabee, who's a conservative, and he states his views on homosexuality and obviously his religion. Through his religion, he believes that he thinks it's a sin and it's not natural. And from her personal end, after Lucy found out that they have that she and Jim were having an affair, Lucy seems like she's drinking even more. Eventually, this also leads to she and Lucy separating, and Ariel gets an apartment. And while she's seeing Jim ends up sending Lucy an email through Ariel's account. Basically, he hacked her account and sent Lucy a message saying that, we're together, here's everything that we've done through our affair, and I'm making a case for our relationship. And at that point, Ariel calls it off and realizes, okay, you're still the same person that I met. You still have all these problems. I don't want anything to do with you. And Ariel reconnects with Lucy, and they make a pact that Lucy would stop drinking and Ariel would stop cheating. They do move back in together, and when they do, Lucy's cat dies. And this ends up leading to them getting 2 new cats. And as Lucy has stopped drinking, Ariel's always kind of been suspicious that, maybe she is. I'm not totally sure. But she does end up getting set up for a book tour in Athens, and so she uses it as an excuse for her and Lucy to go to Greece, and it ends up making her realize that their marriage is solid again, and she's at the age of 37 at this point, and she decides that she's ready for motherhood. And she also decides that with them having a child, she does want to have some sort of a father figure in the parenthood. And so they end up choosing the boy that served them steak the night of the blackout, because he had talked about how he wants to have a child, but he doesn't want to be directly involved. So they figured that he'd be the perfect candidate for it. And so Ariel receives his sperm through artificial insemination. And this does end up leading to her getting pregnant. But on the 4th of July, Lucy comes home, she drives in the driveway, and she's completely drunk. And this leads to, after Lucy passes out, Ariel takes the cats, gets in the car, and she gets a phone call from Lucy basically saying that she's going to jump off their roof and kill herself. And so Ariel calls 911. 911 shows up, and basically she's taken to the hospital, and she's put in the psych ward. And she has a hard time figuring out what's happening to Lucy, but eventually she does get contact, and the whole experience, as she says, it brings her back. And as I said, Ariel's now pregnant upon turning up to the age of 38. And at this point in her and Lucy's relationship, drinking is completely done. And when she's 5 months pregnant, she does an assignment in Mongolia. She asks her doctor, "Is this okay?" And the doctor says, "Yep, it's totally fine." And so she goes to Mongolia. She meets up with a gay conservative named Cox. And while she's in Mongolia, she starts experiencing all these pains. At first, she thinks that it's normal, but it starts to get worse and worse. And then that night, when she goes to her room, as I said, she goes back to her room, and she ends up going into her bathroom, and she starts to bleed everywhere. And then she notices that she has her baby right then and there. And the baby is born alive. The arms are moving, the mouth is moving. But of course, since she was only 5 months pregnant, it's not going to survive. And the doctor confirms that when she calls him. And the doctor also sends an ambulance to get her. And when she goes to the hospital, the doctor does tell her that the baby did die. When she returns from Mongolia, obviously she's depressed. She's in mourning for what would have been her son. Lucy, she ends up finding out that Lucy is going to rehab. She ends up going to rehab. And she finds out that Lucy never stopped drinking. So this whole time when she said that she had stopped, she was drinking. So Ariel's suspicions were correct. She also finds out that the father figure who was going to be the father figure in the parenthood, he decides that he doesn't want to try again. So that basically quashes any chance that Ariel really has for having another chance at having a baby, at least as far as she sees. At this point in the book, Ariel does reflect on when her mother had her mastectomies. So as far as like what she went through, the scarring that she got, and how she never got any implants or anything, like any type of surgery. She basically left everything as it was. And Ariel is empathizing with what her mother went through, because it's like she went through this horrible ordeal, and now she did too, and she now empathizes with that. While Lucy is in rehab, bills are starting to pile up. Ariel kind of feels left out in the cold. She feels betrayed. But while all this is going on, she starts receiving emails from her doctor in Mongolia, who she refers to as Dr. John. And they start emailing each other, telling each other stories back and forth about their lives and what they went through. Like throughout the rest of the story, he tells her his experience in the army, when he first learned to ride a horse. And when Ariel finally goes to visit Lucy in rehab, she decides that she's not ready to be part of Lucy's recovery process. Like she's gone through so much herself that she just can't be a part of Lucy's ordeal. And because of that, Lucy ends up cutting Ariel out of her life. Yeah, they're separated, and Ariel goes to an Al-Anon meeting. And then as they separate, eventually Ariel's just completely single. But at this point, she's spending more time with her friends, Matt and Emma, who is close to her due date because Emma is pregnant. And she's also on the verge of getting married herself. And after that, Ariel then has a fantasy about what it would be like to meet Dr. John. Like she has like a first scenario where they meet, they fall in love, they kiss. Then the second scenario, her going to Africa and they meet, but they don't connect at all. And then the third scenario that she imagines is that they meet, they stay friends, and then they continue to stay in touch after that. And in going to Africa, she ends up getting another really good story. And then her story itself concludes when she ends up traveling to Africa with hopes of a story. Now, as far as how this offers usefulness in understanding the LGBTQIA plus culture, first and foremost, her recounting moments of her life, it kind of gives you a window into what was going on in that culture in the 2000s, as far as them trying to ban gay marriage and all that. Like, you could get a window into what an actual lesbian couple was going through while that was happening to them. I mean, I remember when that was going on personally, but obviously, from my experience, I mean, it didn't. Those things that were going on, even though I did empathize and I felt that it wasn't right, it didn't affect me personally, so I didn't have that connection. It also kind of deals with the dynamics as far as a lesbian marriage. Like, Ariel doesn't feel like she's entitled to call herself a lesbian because it's only her second female love interest that she's ever had. As far as the dynamic of the marriage itself is, it talks about how they're not both wives. Like, she's the wife, and then she says that Lucy is her husband. And in then other cases, you could say, she's the butch or she's the spouse. And that was interesting for me because I am actually friends with a lesbian married couple, and it's interesting because I do see that dynamic with them too. Like, they're not both wives. Like, one is a spouse and one is a wife, and it was interesting to kind of make that connection. Some of the background that does talk about Lucy, when she was in school, she did try to convince another girl in school that she was a boy so that they could date. The story, referring back to what I said earlier, as far as gay culture around the world, in Mongolia there is an underground gay bar called 100%. And throughout the story, as far as mentioning, like, lesbian bars, and the lesbians there had mullets, and Ariel and Lucy kind of consider themselves as being more of like what she refers to as an acceptable lesbian couple. Coming back to Lamar Van Dyke, she was a lesbian activist in the 70s, and it does talk about this in the story. And just as far as her character and how she advocated for rights, and she never wanted to fit in, so she's covered in like homemade tattoos. And coming back to Jen transitioning into Jim, it does make reference that Jim is now able to grow a beard, and he does have a deep voice. However, Jim still has eggs. And then while they're having their affair, Jim mentions that we should have a baby together, use my eggs in your womb. And just that kind of dynamic of Ariel being concerned, well, if I use your eggs, you've been getting all these injections of testosterone, is that going to hurt the baby? So it's kind of interesting to kind of see that window into like what sort of conversation like that would entail if a couple, like, let's say a transgender man and a woman wanted to have a baby and they tried that, what would at least be like the discussions that they would have. So I found that interesting. Another part of the story that I also found very interesting, it doesn't touch on it too much, but it's a conversation that I often see happening like on social media and among friends, and I find it interesting, is touching on Semenya, and as far as how she's a hermaphrodite, and she's this really fast runner, and like how in Africa they don't want her to compete anymore against other women, and there's this stigma, and like testing her and checking to see if she is a man. And I definitely see that a lot in discussions now, as far as how, like, I guess the simplest way that I could put it is, how do we define what's fair in sports? It's like, okay, if a man is born a man and then transitions into a woman, can they compete against other women? If a woman looks as a woman but has unlowered testes as Semenya does, are they still allowed to compete against other women? So on my end, that's a discussion that, and again, I don't have any answer to that either, but I find the discussion very fascinating as far as like, how do we define what's fair in sports, and are sports ever truly fair? So I did like that it did touch on that, and I think that is an important discussion. And as far as how this book can be incorporated into library programming, I do think that it would be great for a book club that dealt with LGBTQIA plus themes. So any type of discussion group that dealt with that, I definitely think it would be great for that. I also think that it would be great for a book club that even dealt with American history, because it does touch on things that happened in our country in the 2000s, and it deals with it in a little bit of a context from the LGBTQIA perspective. So I think it would be good for that. I also think this book would be a really great candidate for being put on display and discussed in general book clubs and public readings for LGBTQIA events, like such as Pride Month. Like during Pride Month, I think this would be a very good book to feature. And since Ariel Levy likes to travel, and that's part of her job, yeah, and as far as reaching out to different people, I would be if I were a librarian, I'd be very interested in actually reaching out to her and see if she'd be interested in coming to my library and possibly giving a presentation on the book, or just a presentation in general, doing a Q&A with an audience, or just doing an interview with one of our staff or me personally, and even doing like a public reading from this book and a discussion after. And maybe even getting some additional insight into her views on LGBTQIA plus issues. All right, and that is it. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much.